To understand why performative trust may be counterproductive, it is helpful to understand the origins of race. Initially, Earth had one climate, and the Earth was called a pangeistic Earth, and everyone had one genotype and phenotype. Then some people began to harm others who were healthy, and this resulted literally in mutated genes and unhealthy people. An example of such harm is, of course, the classic overexposure to solar or UV radiation, which literally edits or mutates your genes. Overexposure and chronic exposure can result in this mutation or unhealth passing to the next generation. So once someone is harmed at a genetic level and they become unhealthy at a genetic level, when they reproduce, their children inherit that trait. This inherited trait and continued exposure to chronic harm results in the creation of a group of people sharing genetic evidence of harm. This group of people sharing genetic evidence of mutations or harm may be called a race of people. Whereas a group of people who remain unmolested or who are healthy form another race of people. For purposes of this discussion, we will call such harm to human beings race harm, which is the act of turning a healthy people by pressing them into an unhealthy people so that their unhealth descends all the way to their genetic code. There is historical and theological evidence of the origins of race harm. Historically, theologically speaking, the practice of race harms is said to have started around 200 years after the flood, in the age of Peleg. Peleg was incidentally a descendant of Noah. He lived in days when the earth was divided into 3 climate zones. In Noah's time, the earth was pangeistic. There was one climate and one continent, one landmass, and one human race. Then the practice of race harm started in the age of Peleg, 200 years after the flood. Noah was still alive, and there were 3 climate zones created. We go into detail about this in the videos on upstream and downstream civilizations. For the purposes of this discussion, one of the zones that are important that we'll talk about that was created was called Hades in ancient Greek, and which is basically translated to hell. And that is the region of the tropics and the equatorial belt. And Hades in ancient Greece and hell in modern lingo is characterized by heat. Now you may ask, why is heck hot? Well, it helps to make healthy people unhealthy. So heck is hot because heat increases viral and bacterial growth, and that helps to make people unhealthy and consequently undesirable. If you are in a lower level of heck, you are likely to encounter both heat and humidity. Humidity increases, and this increase results in increased viral and bacterial transmission. Viral and bacterial growth and transmission result in greater transmission of unhealth and perpetuation of unhealthy people. Overexposure to heat and humidity also results in stigmatization. And this is the most important part. This overexposure to solar and UV radiation results in stigmatization or an adaptation known as burnt skin, which is the melanated skin or burnt, darker skin of people, and the creation of an entire race of people who are exhibiting exposure to such extreme levels of heat and humidity. Now, most importantly, the overexposure to solar and UV radiation results in stigmatization, which is Latin for burnt skin. The heat also results in inflammation to the point that it melts the cartilage in the human nose, and this results in the nose becoming large and amorphous, or misshapen. That is why you see an Australoid people with large and misshapen noses. Moreover, the heat and humidity also renders straight blonde hair dark or frizzy or curly, as you may see in people who have suffered from overexposure to solar radiation in the tropical and equatorial belt. Most alarmingly, overexposure to solar radiation results in sunburn, which drastically lowers immunity, leaving the victim vulnerable to contagious diseases in an already contagious environment. As we went over, heat and humidity increases viral and bacterial growth as well as viral and bacterial transmission, and then the heat also lowers your immunity. To recap, we understand that chronic harm or overexposure to solar radiation results in mutation reaching the germline cells. These mutated genes mean that the harm, trauma, or unhealth has reached a genetic level, which means that unhealth is now hereditary. Signs of this trauma become hereditary. And when unhealth is hereditary and is encoded in the germline cells or the cell's DNA, then we may safely say that health may spread by reproduction. Now, of course, we may ask, how can we reverse race harm uh, and stop the spread of unhealthy and undesirable traits? How do we bring the people back from unhealth and undesirability to health and desirability? An attempt at race improvement may explain, or previous historical attempts may explain why performative trust is not very helpful. So let us also ask ourselves, how may we halt the spread of the unhealthy and make the people healthy and desirable? So let's step back for a minute and imagine we were helping to design the management of a quarantine for people with a spreadable disease or a hereditary condition, a condition that resulted from oppression and race harm. The question is, how would you heal these people? How would you take them from an unhealthy state to a healthy state? So The first thing to do, of course, would be to quarantine these good people who have been wronged. And even if they're not so good, um, that's not pertinent here. We're in matters of um, reform, we do no harm, no matter what kind of a person we're dealing with. So these good people who have been persecuted, oppressed, and raised harm, and as a result, they have become unhealthy and may pass their unhealthy genes and condition to the next generation. Uh, uh, how would you heal them? Well, the first thing, of course, would be to quarantine them, right? Then you would need to do three things at minimum, but first and foremost, uh, you would need to stop the practice of race harm and stigmatization, which is you need to stop afflicting people, healthy people with disease, right? You need to make sure that no more people are being made Australoid, Mongoloid, Melanocroid, mestizo, or unhealthy, and consequently undesirable. So the next thing you would need to do is to make a good faith effort to make the unhealthy people healthy, right? This might take resources and generosity, and therefore this may seem like a bit of an ask for some people, unfortunately. Then you would need to make sure that the unhealthy people in quarantine do not multiply because it would strain resources needed to heal these people and it would strain the state of the quarantine. This is important because people with communicable or hereditary diseases, uh, you know, even in regular medical quarantine, are not exactly encouraged to reproduce either, right? Then the obvious one is lastly is a common sense request is please do not use the quarantined unhealthy people for their labor and they're not to be sexually used or abused because of their vulnerability and because of the fact that uh, they are, there's a power dynamic difference, right? This makes miscegenation of a vice, right? Now we may now ask if we have similar models of treating unhealthy people. Do we have do we actually have institutions that heal physiopathy? Of course we do. These institutions are in the modern world, they're called hospitals. And within hospitals, we lovingly, gently heal all manner of physiopathologies with or without a patient's consent. And now the question we may ask is, if you have gone to a hospital to treat your race harm state, um, has any viewer ever gone there? Have you tried getting help from them to heal your genetics harmed by overexposure to solar radiation? That might be a question you may ask, right? So hospitals do treat people who are non-xanthocroid and overexposed to solar radiation. They may treat localized sunburns and hyperpigmentation. They may also treat disfigurement from mutilation using plastic surgery. But is this what you really want? Is that what you want? I mean, I believe a famous musician tried that, right? The answer is no. You don't really want to be healed through plastic surgery, but you want to heal naturally and organically through a medically sound diet, a medically sound exercise plan, and a healthy and good environment, right? Now, there is a concern, however, that the race harm state of a non-xanthocroid individual is not explicitly legally recognized or medically recognized as a harm state. So if you are wondering why hospitals will not rehabilitate or heal the race harm, uh, if you ever walk in asking for help for, say, your hair or nose or skin color, the answer is that one too many medical practitioners have a history of dismissing diseases that have become normalized, right? For example, even diseases that are not normalized, one too many medical practitioners will dismiss a woman's health concerns and relegate such concerns as psychological, or may even diagnose the woman with hypochondria, right? Now, there are even health insurance firms in some parts of the world who refuse to cover things like acne medication and hair loss and call it cosmetic as opposed to a serious health concern. This is not the case with enlightened parts of the world, obviously, where health insurance companies do cover treatment of acne and hair loss. Uh, Even today, if you walk into a hospital and you ask for treatment for a condition, one too many medical practitioners um, are likely to dismiss diseases as age-related or as part of aging. We hope this changes for the better, uh, but these instances were given to help you realize that you may be unhealthy, but if you go, we're at a point in time in history where modern hospitals may not necessarily treat your race harm state and restore you to a xanthochroid genotype and phenotype. So, and we looked at how we could heal people, and in the past, such attempts have been tried. Uh, this method that we discussed earlier was that we quarantine the unhealthy and therefore undesirable people, and after they become healthy, they may mingle with and freely court the healthy and desirable and have offspring with them. Um, and that is in the case where there are resources and there is aesthetic demand. In the interim, people who are unhealthy and race harmed, they may be quarantined, and this attempted quarantine in the past was evidenced by segregation and separatist laws in the past, and even in the present, through some surreptitious and subtle ways. And most famously, it was known as apartheid, and obviously it was implemented most incorrectly because the people who were quarantined were exploited for their labor. Some of them were enslaved, and others were used sexually instead, and they were also allowed to reproduce. And effectively, it was not a quarantine because people would keep on coming and adding to their numbers from different parts of the world. So this was a terrible implementation. The previous attempts at race improvement or quarantining people did not work so well, because the unhealthy and the undesirable were often allowed to reproduce, despite being ostensibly in quote unquote quarantined ghettos or barrios, right? If a person has a contagious disease, or they have a disease that is hereditary, usually you bring them to a hospital, you make them healthy, and when they're healthy, they can join the rest of the public. But if you keep them in a hospital, but they keep reproducing and increasing in numbers, they're eventually going to break out through the quarantine and join the healthy and desirable general population, whether they're healthy or not, and then spread the contagion. Now, quarantines work if you actively reduce the number of unhealthy and undesirable people. But if you quarantine people and they keep reproducing, then they'll eventually break through this quarantine, right? So, what are the steps to race improvement? The correct way of doing quarantining people apartheid is, first of all, ending further race harm. So first of all, making sure that people who are harming others and making them unhealthy, they're prevented, and measures are taken to keep people healthy. Then the second step is actually, when people are in quarantine, actually trying to make them healthy and desirable instead of using them as slave labor, or instead of working them to death or flogging them or bringing them further into sunshine and making them even more unhealthy in heat, and oppressing them with menial and manual labor, right? That is a recipe for like breaking the quarantine and causing people to be more unhealthy, remaining unhealthy. Um, that should be like common sense, right? And then the third step is prohibiting the spread or increase in numbers of unhealthy and undesirable by regulating the reproduction of the race harmed. So you do not want the unhealthy and undesirable, slaves or people you are already oppressing. You don't want them reproducing. But apparently, not only were they allowed to reproduce, there were healthy people who would um, like have mixed race children with them and engage in acts of miscegenation. And that's even worse, because now you are truly breaking the quarantine, and by pretending that there is some kind of quarantine and actually oppressing people now. And the quarantine becomes like an oppressive area where you're like sexually exploiting these people, and you're exploiting them for their labor, and you're exploiting them for your own sexual gratification. And that's not a good thing, obviously. Not good for the healthy people. It's definitely not good for the unhealthy people, right? Unfortunately, all too few of these measures were not implemented, which often broke the quarantine. And it resulted in not only the spread of the race harmed, but in making the healthy and desirable xanthocroid populations a minority, and eventually dragging the race and flora and fauna of entire regions. Case in point, historically speaking, is ancient Israel, ancient Greece, Spain under the North African rule, and much of the world that is now Melanochroid or Australoid or Mongoloid, including Africa, India, South and Central America, and the Far East. Recall that the Earth was pangeastic and populated by a healthy and desirable xanthocroid people. But today, because race harm is not ended, and we're not healing the unhealthy and the undesirable, and we're not managing the reproduction of the unhealthy and undesirable, and as well as the healthy and desirable, whose reproduction often ends up creating pressures for greater harm. Because we're not doing those things, the xanthocroid population is a minority, globally speaking, unfortunately. The breach in quarantine allows for some benefits. Um, Unfortunately, it results in short-term relief for the unhealthy and undesirable. Uh, Breaking quarantine is likely to be an attractive option for unhealthy and undesirable people, because when you're suffering, you cannot really make informed and judicious decisions that are beneficial for your welfare and for human welfare. And just being out of quarantine feels like freedom and feels like really nice, but in the long term, it is injurious to the general human population. For one-to-many race harmers, a breach in quarantine is beneficial because it allows them to exploit the unhealthy and undesirable. They may do this by hiding the fact that the unhealthy and undesirable are in need of healing first. Instead of these race harmers and exploiters offering the unhealthy and undesirable healing and justice, restoration and compensation, the race harmer and exploiter will attempt to portray the harmed and unhealthy non-white folk as equal to the healthy and desirable folk, like the xanthocroid folk. Uh, they create this illusion so that they may more easily exploit them and prevent them from getting the necessary healing and respite and rest and loving care that the unhealthy and undesirable need, as well as the healthy and desirable need. Because unhealthy race harmed people are deluded into thinking that they're equal to the healthy, privileged, and better off people, the race harmer and oppressors can more easily exploit the uninformed, and they create suffering that results in a continual conflict between the races and between people, and it sharpens individuals into ways of conflict, depriving them of their innocence, humanity, and dignity. This creates a society rife with microaggressions and informal feedback in the form of discriminatory practices, which are further aggravated by anti-discrimination legislation, perhaps. Now, this brings us to further delve into how performative trust uh, is not ideal, and discriminatory feedback in its present crude form is a result of such deliberate illusions and obscurantist and obfuscating measures which attempt to portray the unhealthy and undesirable races as equal to the healthy and desirable races. What is worse than performative trust? It is using force, perhaps, or fascist means of coercing a people to break quarantine or desegregate, particularly in the hot and humid South, as was the case in the United States in the 50s and 60s. And we may ask why. An important answer as to why desegregation was forced is this, perhaps. Maybe desegregation was coerced into society because non-whites were once again, after the Civil War, were being exploited for their labor and for reproductive purposes, despite the end of slavery. This may be viewed as true even today, perhaps. One exception to this is to heal the non-white populations by making love to them, or as the song says, heal them by way of making love to them, perhaps. Now, this ought to be practiced by trained healers or health professionals, and perhaps not the layperson. However, the layperson is encouraged to be kind to people who are stigmatized or non-white. Another reason for forcing desegregation was perhaps this. Under segregation, whites were comfortable living in their segregated zones and could mostly avoid the discomfort of encountering the non-white and unhealthy people while enjoying a relatively blissful ignorance of the plight of the non-white folks. Meanwhile, The non-white folks suffered from health issues that accompanied their oppressed race in their segregated zones. Desegregation was supposed to perhaps force white people to face the wrongs done to non-whites and take steps to heal them and prevent further reproduction of non-whites. A desegregated US, for instance, has brought all too few whites face to face with the suffering of non-white races. The antisocial behavior of the oppressed and unhealthy non-white folk, one too many of them, is become so evident that their race-harmed state may be understood as a menace to society. Unfortunately, one too many may have predictably become desensitized to the suffering of their fellow man. This is predictable since this is the state of affairs in most developing third world low income countries who do not have the willpower or the leadership to segregate, quarantine, heal, and manage the populations of their race harmed people. It has come to a point where newspapers in the US are hiding crimes by non-white minorities, and the public has become largely desensitized to criminal activity resulting from the harm state of the non-white ethnic minorities. For one too many, the gains from racial disparity and desegregation, uh, like an inherent hierarchy and unspoken racial health, social, and historical advantages, seemingly compensates for the occasional riot and frequent antisocial criminal activities. Another possible reason for desegregation that was coerced onto parts of the US could be to frustrate and shame the race harmer who could otherwise count on having evidence of race harmed people hidden away in some ghetto. However, what has happened instead is this has resulted in a few negative side effects. Recall the illustrious and incomparable President John F. Kennedy, who pushed for desegregation at gunpoint. It is odd that President Kennedy from Massachusetts comes from a tradition of offering no peace without justice or equality when it comes to the British. However, when it comes to our own people in the South, the Southerner must be peaceful and coexist and embrace peace at gunpoint, despite the injustice of inserting the race harmed Australoid into southern downstream locales like the southern states of Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. One of the side effects of desegregation may be this. It has made the plight of the non-white race harmed less evident or urgent. Race harm is now a lot more subtle and sophisticated as a result of this forced desegregation. Forced coexistence is never a good idea because it helps sharpen the harmful tools of the opposing parties and hides over hostility, resulting in an increase in neurotic behavior. You may see it with married couples who refuse to get divorced, and you may see it on a macro level with forced coexistence of hostile parties. Another side effect of forced desegregation is the unequal competition that results from putting race-harmed non-white peoples with white peoples. As the comedian Chris Rock says, you have to be superhuman to be accepted as a non-white person in white-dominated activities like athletics. Now that the victims of race harm are pushed onto and are placed in close proximity to the race harmer, it is likely to aggravate the race harmer, who is even more likely to harm the race harmed non-white minorities. This is akin to forcing a rape victim to marry the rapist. When the race harmed, under illusion of being equal, protest when they lose in a competition against the privileged and healthy white folk, they are likely to be accused of being entitled. Um, the frustration and disappointments of the race harmed non-white folk confirm the biases of the healthy white uh, folk. Amongst them might be some race harmers who, at the least, accuse the race harm victim of being entitled or playing the victim or the race card. Meanwhile, the successes of the race harmed non-white folk doubly provoke the wrath and sense of injustice felt by the white folk, the privileged and healthy folk. Amongst them might be one too many race harmers who are forced to coexist with such a harmed peoples. As race-harmed non-white people are forced to coexist with healthier white people, the competition between the two races lowers the quality of life of both. Competition almost always worsens the lot of peoples, as is evidenced by any racially disparate, overpopulated, overcrowded country. If you include non-whites without healing them and restoring them to health and whiteness, you are likely to lower the quality of life of everyone. But even in moderately populated first world developed or high income countries, we see that non-whites, when they are included into a healthy population, end up compensating for their non-whiteness or their race harm state by often worsening the lot of everyone involved. For example, the inclusion of non-whites into American football has made the sport dangerous and injurious to the point of the sport becoming uh, composed primarily, number one, of non-white players. When it was a homogeneously white people sport, the whites used to wear leather helmets and padding at best. Now, people, whether they're white or not white, the players have to wear a military grade armor, and people are still ending up with life-altering injuries. Now, basketball is moving in a similar direction. Um, uh, whereas uh, uh, when the sport was primarily dominated by homogeneously white peoples, um, uh, people were safer and they didn't have to wear face masks and try so hard to get out of poverty. This is a natural outcome of using non-whites for display and entertainment instead of healing them into whiteness and health. If you do that, you will naturally end up getting these monstrous gentlemen who try harder and harder to compensate for their stigmatized skin and their poverty. This is applicable to any field of endeavor where you try to insert race-harmed people traumatized by poverty and race harm. It applies to athletics, applies to law, medicine, and academia. An anecdote illustrating this phenomenon goes like this. I stumbled upon a group of white lawyers in the United States who were discussing a work-life balance. In their midst comes a Hispanic illegal warehouse worker who had recently started working as a lawyer. This Hispanic lawyer's response to the grumblings of white workers and complaints about their work-life balance was this. I can, he said, the Hispanic worker goes, I can outwork all of you and be underpaid, and it still improves my lot and not yours. So if you insert traumatized, poor, and race-harmed non-white people, um, you're going to lower the quality of life of everyone. And another example illustrating the perils of this unregulated vindictive desegregation is so. Suppose a supplicant approaches a traumatized African priest who is used to walking bare feet on the savannah to the point of his feet developing calluses. Uh, the supplicant, a member of the congregation, might approach the priest and ask this of the priest. He might say, Reverend, could you please pray that I get a new pair of shoes? I have a hole in my shoe and it is highly uncomfortable. And God said, ask me for everything, even if it is a shoelace. So here I am asking you for a shoe. The priest is likely to find the request of the supplicant spoiled. He might view the congregation, member of the congregation as spoiled, and he's likely to laud the merits of poverty and suffering and the importance of going bare feet, just as he had, thereby bringing down the quality of life of the people around him. So another example of why forced desegregation may not always be ideal is the following, which comes from a real life incident. At a top Ivy League university, um, the student government was asked by the administration if the university uh, should include raspberries as part of the diet of undergraduate students at dining halls. This innocent question was met with vociferous opposition by students from third world developing low income countries who denounced this measure, saying that the wealthy white students were already spoiled and they did not need to enjoy the added luxuries of eating raspberries. The moral of the story is this. When you refuse to quarantine, manage the population, heal, restore, compensate the race harmed, traumatized, and simply insert them into the general population, you may end up worsening the lot of nearly everyone in the long run. There is a deeper and more important lesson. Above all, do not use harm or punitive measures to reform a people. Do not use punitive measures or pain or suffering to reform people, because when you do that, you get the racial and financial and psychological disparity, which results in conflict and drags everyone down eventually. Maybe a solution is to reform through a Holy Spirit and a holy environment in a manageable way. Unregulated convenient, ineffective, and inefficient desegregation also results in diminishing the importance and urgency um, of healing the race harmed from their harmed state. If a race harmed non-white people are told they are the same as everyone, particularly the healthy white folk, or they are equal to the healthy white folk, uh, when they have not been healed, it takes away from everyone a more just, equal, and healthy society. We would like everyone to have equal rights, but we're not presently equal at all. We would like everyone to be equal. Uh, Unfortunately, we're not equal at all. This inequality does not mean that you should harm people. It simply means that those who have been harmed need to be treated in a better manner. So the US may have desegregated deliberately with the intent of bringing about racial xanthocroid homogeneity and equality. Unfortunately, a host of factors may have undermined the effort, resulting in the undesirable outcome of increased racial disparity. The first of these factors undermining desegregation is the opening up of immigration into the US from non-Northern European countries with the Hart-Celler Act of 1965. One of the major motivators deciding US foreign policy uh, in those days was the fear of what the communists will say about the treatment of non-whites in the US. President John F. Kennedy, for instance, tried to point out the absurdity of such measures before giving into it reluctantly. Hart-Celler not only increased racial disparity, it diluted measures that were meant to improve the health and equality of the people of the land and the world. It seems unbelievable to the viewer, but the viewer will do well to remember that FDR in World War II took similar measures to improve civil rights from fear of what the Japanese would say about the US mistreatment of African Americans. Uh, you may want to improve the lot of a people correctly, uh, and never out of fear of what your opponent might say. This tendency might have arisen from a psychology of one too many US high schoolers who want to be popular and value popularity over doing the right thing, perhaps. Since Hart-Celler and even before Hart-Celler, other factors like illegal entry of millions of mestizos, Asiatics, and Australoids has aggravated racial disparity and a breach of quarantine or segregation. Hart-Celler and increased racial disparity resulted in an era of paying lip service to equality and justice. This propelled and was also in turn stimulated by the civil unrest of the 1960s. The data shows that post-Hart-Celler, the unhealthy and traumatized non-white immigrants coming from the developing and low-income economies of the world increased in numbers exponentially. On the other hand, people coming from healthier parts of the world, like Northern Europe, started avoiding the US on account of the incoming unhealthy folk from developing and low income economies. And this resulted in further aggravation of demographic health and increased racial disparity. Next, we will return to how performative trust can undermine attempts at healing a race-harmed people. As we mentioned earlier, one of the major concerns with trusting first is that it is not an organic sentiment and it must be conjured up or promoted through sheer willpower. Uh, the second bigger concern is this discrimination that is insensitive, crude, reactionary, and vague is not desirable. But even the worst form of discrimination, even if it hurts our feelings and at worst may, in the worst case scenario, may further race harm, discrimination reminds us that we or our ancestors have been oppressed and race harmed, and hence we are not as healthy or desirable as the fortunate folk. Now, discrimination-related feedback, when delivered by a layperson, may offend or hurt a person's feelings, and it is not ideal, but it still reminds a person to ask for justice and healing from race harm. But when race harm is normalized and pervasive or widespread, uh, actual feedback about harm or discriminatory feedback is usually hurtful. Uh, and it is so hurtful that it may make the race harmed, non-white, non-xanthocroid victim of harm defensive and perhaps even irrational. Uh, we have to, as a society, be careful about discrimination further aggravating affairs. However, any feedback about discrimination ought to be welcomed so as to identify any opportunities for rehabilitation, reparations, or restoration for both the victim of race harm, the unhealthy and undesirable folk, as well as those giving the feedback in the form of discrimination. We may also want to understand why the uh, unhealthy and undesirable do not want uh, feedback in the form of discrimination. Now, discriminatory feedback is often received poorly because victims of race harm are so traumatized that they simply may not be able to handle the bitter truth revealing their harmed condition, that they have been oppressed and harmed in the past. Truth is like honeyed sweet water, but if you let drip even a drop of honeyed water on an open wound, you are likely to cause the recipient of the truth some aggravation. To victims who have suffered chronically, who are merely receiving feedback or discrimination, but not healing, more feedback can be just another drop of water falling upon the victim of, say, water drop torture. More importantly, performative trust hides the race harmers' crimes because it causes people to normalize a race harmed state. You see, it is in the interest of the race harmer if the victim confuse their race harm state for a healthy state. So when the unhealthy claim that they are healthy, it pleases the person who made them unhealthy, and they would rather agree with them. Most importantly, if discrimination as feedback is suppressed instead of acted upon to heal the unhealthy, and if the unhealthy think that they are in fact healthy, then the race harmer can then continue to make people unhealthy and undesirable. And all too few may stop the harm. Therefore, it's rather important that we do not normalize what is unhealthy, because it ends up hiding race harm and allows the race harmer to continue to race harm. Another side effect of normalizing the unhealthy or minimizing the race harm suffered by them is this: it discourages the urgency and importance of positive justice for the victims of race harm. Justice means restoration or restoring the unhealthy and undesirable to health and desirability, and compensating them for their suffering for the time that they were unhealthy and undesirable. At the same time, we must do justice to the race harmer as well. By that, we mean that we want to be also good to the race harmer. Justice for the race harmer means restoring the race harmer to the original state of man, the state of a race healer, or somebody who heals people and restores them to the xanthocroid or healthiest of races. It also means compensating the race harming criminal for the crime of race harm, because crime is a punishment unto itself. And we will take this opportunity to express our deep love and admiration for the criminal race harmer, because surely it must take a lot of patience, a lot of suffering, and a lot of courage for them to harm a fellow human being into becoming unhealthy and undesirable. So now we come to the point that if recognition of race harm, feedback to the race harmed, or treatment of the race harmed is discouraged, if race harm is accepted as a norm, and race harming criminals are not rehabilitated, if the disparate races are portrayed or misportrayed as diversity, or they are portrayed as a positive, and if the above continues, then it eventually drags entire civilizations down. This is what happened to ancient Greece. It happened to the Jews in ancient Israel. This is also what happened to the now race-harmed civilizations, as each successive generation eventually becomes equally race-harmed. This is a natural outcome of punitive justice and palliative methods of reform. The solution, of course, is to not hurt people if you want to reform them. Again, as a gentle reminder that discrimination, which is sensitive and informed, is perhaps a spur towards justice. Discrimination reminds us that a crime has occurred. It is feedback which is oft given, unfortunately, once too often given out of fear for personal and social safety. And this is a natural reaction. Um, However, we would like to systematize it and make it methodical, and um, make it more informed and sensitive. If discriminating feedback is given with sensitivity and empathy, it gives valuable information, namely that a crime of race harm has occurred, and someone healthy and desirable is no longer healthy and desirable, and hence we must act upon it. In this way, the person who has the courage to give discriminatory feedback, hopefully it is sensitive and empathetic, uh, is doing something for the greater good. So, gentle, sensitive, empathetic, discriminating feedback reminds us that the victim of race harm, people who are non-xanthocroid, who may be Australoid, Mongoloid, mestizos, even melanocroid, such victims of race harm need healing, restoration, beauty, and health, while it also spurs us to compensate the victim of race harm with reparations. Lastly, gentle, sensitive, empathetic, actionable, discriminating feedback reminds everyone that the practice of race harm must end and the race harming criminal must be gently, lovingly restored to health themselves. For crime and harm is a punishment in itself, and it takes a lot of suffering and trauma for a human being to begin to harm others and use harm as a method of reform. Next, we will go over nepotism and amoral familialism and its relationship with amoral familialism.